Thank you for joining us today, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So I wanted to start off with a couple of definitions. Now, I did not ever hear the term cognitive science before I was in my early 30s. So what is cognitive science?
Cognitive science, basically the science of the mind, right? So looking at how the mind operates in terms of what we attend to, how I would define it, and I don't know if this is a textbook definition exactly, but the study of the mind, essentially looking at the different, what we call cognitive processes, like attention, which the article focused on, as well as learning and memory, decision-making, perceptual processes, and other cognitive functions.
And your paper was published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology, which is a bit of a bigger umbrella. How would you define what environmental psychology is?
Yeah, so I think it can mean a couple of things. In the broadest sense, it essentially looks at how the environment can influence our behavior or aspects of cognition, or on the other hand, how aspects of cognition or our behavior can influence the environment. And of course, the paper that we're talking about today is looking at the environment in terms of like the natural environment and things like climate change, like in that. But environmental psychology can be a bit broader. So the effects of taking a test in a all red room compared to an all white room or something like that.
Yeah, I find it a bit confusing with environmental psychology, how it is so broad that it brings in these ideas of like, if your room is painted blue or red, it affects you, or it goes right into like your attitude towards using disposable cups and whether you engage in like political activism. I wish that they would separate those two things because I don't think they should come under the same name.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. I believe the history probably started with the more general influences on the environment, and then more recently, more sustainability issues and how that affects how we think and how we think affects those behaviors related to that.
And just to get it even broader with the questions, and I'm sure people have asked you this before, but what is the difference between neuroscience and cognitive science? I'm sure this has been answered, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that and perhaps how it is different when we're talking about this particular issue of attention.
Yeah, so I mean, they can be the same thing in some degree. So like cognitive neuroscience, but strictly speaking, right, cognitive science need not mention or concern the brain. And neuroscience, on the other hand, need not consider cognitive processing, right? So neuroscience is very broad, and some folks like myself are interested in how the brain relates to behavior and cognition, whereas other folks are more interested in what's happening at a cellular level and not directly measuring behaviors. And the same thing with cognition. Some people are interested in how our behaviors and cognitive processes relate to an underlying neural substrate, whereas other people are just interested in the behaviors themselves.
And what is so fascinating about how this has come to our world of sustainability is that most people, in my experience, who are working as sustainability managers, climate campaigners, they're working for not-for-profits, really don't have a lot of background or a lot of awareness around psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science. Like I mentioned, like I'd done this all my life and I studied environmental engineering. I worked as a green building engineer. I didn't even know it existed until I was already in my early 30s. What do you think the problem is when we have an entire profession based on trying to influence people to do environmental change and they don't understand this field at all? Like what's the problem with all of us being in the dark?
That's a good question. And I guess to a certain degree, you could think about that on the flip side, where some of us are studying these things in the laboratory, and it's very far removed from actual engagement and getting people to take these steps that need to be taken. So those two things ideally would be more interwoven with each other. But there's just so much information out there that it's hard to be an expert or be, I guess, knowledgeable about perhaps everything. I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but
well, why don't I try just asking it this way? Why should we take it seriously? If I've got to try and get thousands of people to electrify their homes, governments to pass policy, people to switch to EVs, start growing their own food, all these things we have to do, like, why do we need to start taking cognitive and psychological research seriously?
well, because some of the results, right, that we're finding can maybe make that job a little bit easier, right? For example, in the paper, right, we are seeing that positive images of climate change solutions are what's capturing observers' attention relative to the more frightening images of full effects and causes of climate change. And so if you have that information, it may lead you to a more direct and a more effective piece of persuasive communication, perhaps. Of course, what we're doing is in the laboratory, and we don't know how well that generalizes outside of the laboratory at this point, but it might be helpful.
And so let's dive into the research. What was the big message that we can get from this recent research you did?
Yeah, so I mean, up until this point, most of the research that I had looked at was really just kind of asking people to maybe sort images of what they thought were the most impactful or the most relevant to climate change, or having people rate images, basically using subjective measures that aren't getting directly at behavior. And so we wanted to know at a behavioral level, do people attend to climate change relevant images more so than just regular ordinary images? Or is this something that folks don't attend to? And a little bit of my background, I've recently kind of got into this research looking at how climate change images influence behavior like attention. Prior to that, more broadly looking at how emotional stimuli capture attention. So things like facial expressions that might not have anything to do with climate change or environmental psychology, but are nevertheless important ways that we communicate with each other. So I'm coming at this from an affective science perspective, where my background is in studying cognition and emotion, their interaction, and in particular, the interaction between cognition and emotion that affects how affective stimuli influence observers' attention. And so we've seen that a number of other types of emotional images, facial expressions, weapons, poisonous or predatory animals, words, all these types of things will capture an individual's attention. They'll spend more time looking at those types of images than neutral images or images that are non-emotional, basically. And so we were wondering whether or not this would apply to these climate change relevant images that have been found to elicit subjective emotional responses. But up until this point, we didn't know whether or not they would drive someone's attention. And the initial study that we did that was published in 2019, which is a study that was published prior to the article, I think, that you disseminated to this group, we saw that indeed that was the case, that these emotionally salient climate change relevant images did capture attention. However, in that article, we did not really separate these images into things that were more positive, like solar panels or windmills, potential solutions of climate change, or negative images. We just kind of grouped them all together and saw that they captured attention. And so with this most recent article, we are interested in seeing whether or not there was a difference in terms of emotional valence or negative. And we expected the opposite of what we found, just given that in the larger field of affective science, you see this negativity bias where things that are threatening do tend to capture our attention. The things that are positive also do, but things that are threatening seem to capture it even more so. So we thought perhaps those negative images of climate change would be the ones that were the most attention grabbing, but that actually didn't turn out to be the case. What we found were the positive images of climate change solutions across a number of studies were the ones that captured our attention, whereas those images of potential causes and effects of climate change, like industrial pollution, natural disasters, these types of things, didn't tend to capture observers' attention. They did influence their behavior we saw a general slowing of reaction time to the negative images relative to the positive images, but this didn't seem to facilitate the task and didn't seem to facilitate their attention orientation. So it's not that they're not affecting them, it's just not affecting their attention.
Right, and you use this phrase a lot, this freeze response. Could you explain a bit more about what this is and what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's basically deer in the headlights type of response where there's a threat within the environment, an animal, an organism will tend to momentarily suspend all their behaviors, the muscles become rigid, and this may only happen momentarily. And we don't know if that's exactly what's happening with the negative images that had a slower reaction time, but it has been proposed previously in the same paradigm that we used for other types of negative stimuli, that if you see this slowing of reaction time, it may represent a freezing effect.
Right. So when people are looking at climate, I use the phrase climate doom. So we'll use the climate doom images can cause a fight or flight, deer in the headlights type of response where we just freeze in and our cognition slows. Is that correct? Our attention goes down and our cognition slows versus a solutions-based image actually increases our attention and kind of draws us in. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, exactly. So overall, when we presented the negative images, and maybe I should take a step back and just kind of describe the task a little bit. It's called the dot probe task.
That's my next question. What is the dot probe?
Yeah, so the dot probe task is a measure of spatial attention. So we present two stimuli on the screen, something like this. One of them in this case was a climate change relevant image that could either be positive or negative. And then the other image was just a neutral image that was balanced on a number of characteristics, or a non-emotional image, I guess I should say, that's not relevant to climate change. And then after those two stimuli that are presented one on each side of the screen disappear, there's a small target that'll be on one side of the screen or the other. It's hard to do this kind of in reverse, but in the participant's task is to just locate that target or to make some decision about the target. And the idea is if they are able to respond to the target quicker when it's occurring behind the climate change relevant image, or just in general, the emotionally salient image, that gives us an idea that their attention was already directed to that side of the screen, right? The stimulus that immediately preceded it. And that's what we found in the study, is that detection of the target was facilitated by these positive images of climate change solutions. And then overall, whether or not the negative image exceeded the spatial location of the target, or if it was on the opposite side, it resulted in slower reaction times in general. So the spatial location of the threatening image didn't influence the general slowing. It was just the mere presence of that image on either side of the screen. And it could be either spatially congruent or incongruent with the target stimulus. So the dot probe task measures attentional bias or attention to emotionally salient stimuli, has been used since about 1984, 1986. So it's a very old and established task in that affective attention realm, and then has more recently been applied to these climate change relevant images.
And you use the term valence, which I just wanted to get out there a bit more because it was the first time I'd heard it described. And this kind of like in our movement of practitioners, this concept of showing problems of climate change versus solutions, it's really quite nascent. Even being able to describe it that way is something that's, I mean, I don't think people are really even like the zeitgeist or the consciousness hasn't even grown yet to even categorize climate change in terms of problems versus solutions. So it's very nascent. And so I really like the idea of being able to get that concept out there of what is the valence of your climate communications. So can you just describe what you mean by that word?
Yeah, so valence comes from dimensional models of emotion. So in emotion theory, we can think of emotions as discrete, separate emotions like fear, happiness, sadness, disgust, or not being these discrete emotions, but being somewhere on different gradients of emotional dimensions. And one of those is valence that can range from positive to negative. And then another emotion dimension would be something like arousal, where you could be very calm, in a almost sleep-like state, or very excited. And so in these dimensional models of emotion, we don't necessarily categorize emotion into, again, fear, happiness, anger, etc., but as a particular point in space on a number of different dimensions. The most two prominent would be valence and arousal, and then the valence would just be that positive versus negative aspect of emotion.
Right. So we can just have like a single axis, like an x-axis of negative, or we could have like a multi-dimensional valency that perhaps had different, what I don't know, jealousy to, I don't know, not being jealous, or maybe scared to being safe. So there's like a whole bunch of different valencies we can consider.
Yeah, so I mean, valence in general, I think would range from to negative, but you could add other dimensions in there. So things like arousal, calm versus excited, or dominance, how much control over the situation you might have. And so there's a number of dimensions. And yeah, the most easily digestible is the model with valence and arousal. And then it just gets more complex, the more dimensions. And certainly it's probably the case that emotion is complex and involves more than just those two dimensions, but that's a good starting place.
And do you think when it comes to climate change that fear does not appear? Now, I can't remember whether this is something I wrote or whether I copied it from your paper, where it says fear does not appear to work as a tactic to motivate engagement. Is that what you wrote in your paper? Is that the overall thing we can get out of it?
I'm not sure if I wrote that exactly in my paper either. And I would, based on our results, I would come to that similar conclusion, or at least our results would suggest that, although, again, we didn't in our paper really measure engagement or anything like that. We just measured attentional behavior. So taking that next step, I think, would probably require some additional research or seeing how that actually affects engagement. But certainly, based on our results, it would seem that more positively framed information about potential solutions would be more effective. And I think there's additional research out there that would also come to that conclusion. And again, it's not that the negative information isn't important or isn't seeing the participants in some way, but it doesn't seem to be grabbing their attention in the same way.
Well, one thing that when I was reading your paper, I had this thought of a paradox that we're in, where in order to get people to understand the gravity of climate change, which is genuinely very, very scary. Oops, sorry, now I'm getting a phone call. Thanks, sweetie. Sorry. For us to communicate the gravity of climate change, which is why we should do very drastic things, we really do need to understand how bad it is. But then we can't just get stuck in that. We also need a vision of a future that we want to be a part of, that's inspiring for leadership. We also need to know what the solutions are. We need to imitate the solutions. So we're really stuck in the whole environment and climate change movement. It's kind of stuck in this paradox of needing to communicate these two things. And we've mostly gone towards the communicating the scary threat. There's really been very little of communicating the solutions and the better type of future in terms of the ratio of when you put them together. So, which made me think of a couple of things. One is there a kind of a golden ratio that you've sensed from your research of how much we should be communicating of either? Because I don't think we can be completely 100%, here's the solutions, utopian vision of the future. I do think we definitely do need a streak of really understanding that if we don't do this, things could be really bad. But one of the things is there is a golden ratio. And the other thought I had about this was that in storytelling narratives, it's something that's taught in how you tell a story, which is to show a sense of like a roller coaster of alternatives, that you show people like the highs and the lows of the story. What I'm trying to say is contrast, not roller coaster. That these are the possible vision what you could have, or it could be like this. And you tell stories in terms of these polar opposites, and the more undulating, the kind of like sine curve of the story makes the story really engaging. So I've put a whole bunch of things in that question, but what are your thoughts in terms of like ratios and showing both, and when and how we should use either?
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea of this golden ratio. That's very intriguing.
Designer, it's just a design term.
Okay. Well, it's new to me, but certainly I don't know if that exists based on the research that we've done. But definitely, you're right that you can't just have all this information about the solutions. And there's certainly explaining what the consequences are very important to getting out the message as well. But they might not be the part that's grabbing attention, at least to the degree that we see. Your question, the way that you framed it in terms of it being a higher percentage of the negative information out there, also made me think that maybe we're seeing perhaps this positive bias in our data just because it's maybe a little bit more novel. You're not seeing as much of it. And so now that's attention grabbing because it's novel, relatively novel. Maybe people have heard the negative narrative over and over and they're familiar with it, so they don't need to engage with it as much as the potential information that they might not have as much exposure to. So yeah, I think definitely trying to find that golden ratio would be important. What that might be, I unfortunately don't know and don't have much insight on that.
Right, but I suppose what we can garner from the research is that attention matters. We can't at this stage necessarily prove that attention is that there is a bridge from, I mean, in terms of the academic research, that there's a direct bridge from attention to political engagement and behavior. But we're assuming that there is. We're assuming that if we can capture people's attention and we can avoid this freezing effect, then we can move to the next stage more easily, which is when we're actually asking people to do something.
Yeah. And I just was looking at a paper earlier today, this review paper. And so there's been a couple of other papers that have come out in the last couple of years looking at how climate images or climate information capture attention. And this paper showed that if we manipulate what people attend to, and so we make one part of the screen more salient with a flashing light or whatever it is, like right now on the screen, my box is highlighted, so you might be drawn to that. That if we highlight and make salient the environmental information, it does lead to higher judgments of risk, the dangers of ignoring certain information. So there is some new information coming out suggesting that there is more of a direct link between what we attend to and what we believe and how we act. So yes, even though our paper didn't show that link directly, other research is coming out that does show that, and also shows that feelings or positive emotions are also more likely to get people to engage in climate-friendly behaviors.
Well, it also got me thinking, and this is going to be my last question before I open it up to everybody, that part of the missing link is that when you have a climate solutions image, it directly gives you something that you can imitate. It's inescapable that you can separate it from an action, because a picture of a solar panel or a picture of a vegetable garden is directly something that I can imitate. It is embedded with an action. Whereas something scary like a polluted landscape or a smokestack, there's nothing I can do, like in terms of something I can manufacture in my life. I can perhaps get mad about it, but it's not directly hooked into an action. And I think a lot of people don't, well, when I talk about a lot of people, I mean a lot of people in my environmental engineering and science world perhaps haven't quite truly grasped the nature of how humans imitate each other, that we're completely creatures of imitation and copying others. And so what I think is perhaps the next step from your research to extrapolate the argument from is that when we see a solution, okay, it grabs our attention more, it makes us feel better, but I can imitate that. And that's the core nature of how humans do stuff. Well, probably one of many core natures, but it's one there. And that's totally missing from pictures of climate doom.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Certainly the negative images can make us frustrated and maybe depressed a little bit, but the positive images do give us potential behavior route to go down. And I think our study used maybe more abstract positive images that maybe aren't directly accessible to every individual. Every individual won't necessarily be able to put up a windmill or a solar panel, depending on where they live, but they can fight for those energy sources. And I guess another potential, we could expand our image database to include other types of solutions that might be more accessible to individuals. And perhaps we would even see this bias being greater.
I mean, it is something in my own just design work I'm having to bring up over and over again in every project. I've got to remember to do it in my own work and with everybody I work with, is that we have to show images of people doing the things you want them to do. We can't just show data. We can't just tell them with words. There has to be like a picture. If you're asking somebody to use a reusable coffee cup, you need to show a picture of that person doing it. You can't just say, plastic is destroying the ocean. Now get your mind, okay, you're thinking plastic is destroying, now get your mind completely over here and now do something, and you have to imagine in your mind what it is. You just got to show a picture of the person doing it. If you're saying put in curtains, close your curtains in winter to stop the heat coming out, you've got to like just show a person doing it. And with the solutions images, it's not just about it feeling nicer. It's really just showing like this really hooking into our nature to do acts of imitation. But anyway, sorry, did you want to say anything before I jump into the questions, Josh?
No, I think I'm ready.
Cool. I'm just always summarizing without actually asking a question. Now, the first question we had here was Catherine Canapelli. Catherine, you've got your hand up. Can you ask your question of Josh?
Yeah, so I'm involved with a prop tech or an energy tech solution, and this is for buildings. It automates the process of managing and controlling plug load, which is to date completely unregulated, meaning not controllable. It's measurable, but can't be controlled, and we've solved that. And so we automate that process. My questions is related to the response of an occupant. So this is for a facility manager might buy this and install it to reduce energy consumption dramatically, 20% within a building. So it's not insignificant, but it does take some perceived control away from the individual. So in terms of imagery or ideas, and that idea of, is it the Valence, emotional Valence? What are mechanisms to inspire the occupant who's actually sitting at a desk and has never really thought about what's being used from their devices and feels powerless to control it except for turning things off, which doesn't really work very well or consistently? How do we ensure that they feel good about it, that they feel empowered themselves, and actually that it stimulates them taking that experience outside of the office, outside of the workplace, to make change in a similar or different way that's positive for climate change?
That's a huge, complex question.
I'm sorry. It's a huge, complex system.
Yeah, so let me see if I can just restate that, and so that I make sure I try to answer it correctly. But basically, you have a system set up where it automates some kind of energy consumption from the employees.
Correct.
And does the system also allow, I guess,
they can override it with a smartphone, so they have some degree of control.
Okay.
They're not out of luck at any point.
Yeah.
Unless they forgot their smartphone.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but I think that just feedback, I don't know if you would do this necessarily at the end of a shift or something, but was a smiley face or something like, you saved this much energy or whatever, or a neutral face if they didn't save that much energy. And if you wanted to extend that to the home environment, then perhaps a way for them to have something that would measure their energy consumption at home and provide similar, valent, I guess, feedback, perhaps. I'm
thinking in that emotional context of reaction and interaction and how to prevent negative action. And it may be visual, to your point, or it may be verbal. It may be on an app. It comes through many directions, but I acknowledge it was a big question. I'm grappling with that.
Yeah, certainly. It wouldn't have to be visual. It could be verbal, auditory, just any type of feedback that I guess would reward the behaviors that you're looking for. I think would be effective in that way.
Thank you.
Catherine, I've got the recording from, I actually did the recording again with Jap Ham, who studies the light-based feedback. I can make sure I've sent you, I haven't edited it yet, but I've got the raw recording that I did a second time with him. It's really interesting. There's a lot of depth in that, although it's kind of like a different topic to this positive versus negative climate images. Okay, we've got Yoled next in line.
Hi, so I had two questions. One of them, do you think, or did you check if people's responses were also related to their attitudes? Like if somebody was generally more negative, then was the positive, like had a more negative attitude towards climate change, would the positive image get even more attention? Like, is this a prediction era thing that we're actually seeing? Yeah, that's the first one. Thanks.
Yeah, so good question. In terms of, we didn't measure their subjective affective state at any time in this study, but that is a good point. And we've done some more recent work that is not published yet, that where we are doing attention training to increase this attentional bias to climate change images. And we found that is effective, or that we can do that we can increase the degree to which an individual focuses on these types of images. But what we haven't done in that study either is add that mood. Are you a positive or a negative mood right now? And I think that's an important piece that.
Or even are you like, is your attitude towards climate change positive or negative? That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so that we assessed. So we collected data with a questionnaire that assessed general environmental disposition, so that it would be scored as more pro-environmental or more anti-environmental. That's probably not the right term, but would have a lower pro-environmental disposition. And so the data from that is kind of confusing, because the first study that we did found that there was a positive relationship between attentional bias to climate change relevant images and pro-environmental disposition. So the more likely you were to support or had a pro-environmental disposition, the greater your attentional bias was to these images. But we found the exact opposite thing in the most recent paper, which was a little bit surprising. But I think the reason that we see that is because of the task that we use, or at least in part, the task that we use, the dot probe task. While it's great at measuring attentional bias, it's not a good measure of individual differences. And so overall, although the task can be used to overall assess differences in conditions, it's not very good at distinguishing the degree of attentional capture from one individual to another. And that's been kind of shown more broadly in the task using things like affective faces or word stimuli as well. So the task is unreliable as a measure of individual differences, but it is reliable as an overall measure of experimental condition. I don't know if that distinction makes sense to everybody here, but basically all the effects that I've been talking about from the task are experimental condition based, which the task is perfectly suited for, but looking at an individual level, it becomes a little bit more murky. And so
and that's sort of my second question is, could it be that some, or at least some people, were just actually so much more paying attention to the negative image that it disturbed the task they were supposed to do?
Yeah, it certainly could be the case that they were paying attention to. Yeah, so I guess in that sense, it would be measuring attention in a different way, and I wouldn't be able to comment on whether or not that was happening exactly. So to do that, I think would be interesting. And the next step would maybe to look at the neural response to these images and to see if we are seeing something happening at that neurocovert level that we can't measure behaviorally for the negative images. But so it could be the case that their attention was drawn to the negative images and away from the task at hand. although we don't necessarily see that with other images, like an angry face or a knife or something. Those usually facilitate behavior in the task, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen here. Those images might just be processed differently.
Yeah, that's a really interesting angle on the interpretation of the response. Darren, would you like to ask your question?
Get off mute. Yeah, what I would really love to see is the reaction of people in your research. If the actual solutions, the concrete solutions that they can take action on today were somehow communicated to them, so that when they were seeing an image, positive or negative, how would they react knowing that they could actually make a difference, each of them individually? I don't have any suggestion on how to do that, but I would love to be a part of getting that kind of reaction out of people, because that's all the solutions we need exist today. And we just need individuals to take action, whether it's changing careers or getting their company to do something or taking personal individual actions. And there's just so many of them that people could actually do.
Right. Can I just dive into that just so I understand the question a bit more? So are you saying, Darren, that if the solutions-based picture that someone's looking at is, instead of it just being like random, like just like solar panels, it's more of a very action-orientated image, like
exactly
solar on your house, call this number, and then testing their engagement, that you actually might get a different, or perhaps a more kind of attention engagement kind of like response. Like you could put the attention together with an action kind of response to kind of like go a little bit deeper into this effect. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly. And all of your work, Katie, has brought that to mind in how we can see the difference visually.
Unfortunately, though, I have still yet to ever install a solar panel or electrify a home. And I know you're very, very nice to me on the internet, but I still feel like a bit of a failure in that I'm not doing very well on all the stuff that you do. But anyway, I don't want to hog the question, so I'll really let Josh answer it.
Yeah, of course, that would be great if we could do that. Our goal here was very simple and was just to see whether or not these images or these types of stimuli do capture attention. And the idea would be then, based on our results, that activists or people that can help motivate people to change their behavior would then utilize that to whatever degree that they can. But that's not to say that we're not interested in looking at how this behavior might relate to those types of things. And so I think that's a good line or a good avenue for future research. Of course, most of our participants, if not all, are university students. So some of the things like installing a solar panel are beyond their means at this time. But yeah, I think it is a goal for our lab to try to identify or do something where we can link whether or not these attentional preferences or these attentional biases link to behaviors that occur outside of the laboratory and have a real world effect. That would be one of the next steps anyway.
Well, it would be fun to chat. I'm imagining a study that doesn't bother showing the doom images at all. We're just in solutions images, and then we're getting more granular about different types of action design. So you're putting solutions. So we're only on the positive valency, but getting really granular about the valency, and then putting it together with like social norms and different styles of call to action and different colors of the way things are worded, which is practically all of us who are doing climate design. We're doing this every day. We're like, how do we make it all look on the page and make it work? And looking at how the call to action works with the positive response. Okay, so we've got Aaron Gabriel next.
Yeah, cool, thank you. Yeah, I'm really appreciating the talk and the questions. So mine's a bit of a two-parter, and I feel like you just answered a lot of it in the last two. But so the first one is, I read a paper recently that went into like nature connection, effect, and well-being, and it made the really cool distinction between hedonic well-being, like feeling good, and eudaimonic well-being, like actually functioning well. And so one curiosity I had was like, is that something you all are looking at as like functioning well, all that? But I think from the last questions, you're mostly just focused on attentional at this point. So I'm just curious if that's anything you're thinking about looking at. And then the second one is in terms of like the impact, which again, right now just sounds like it's what's capturing people's attention. But I'm curious if you're looking at sequences, like in a recent conversation, we were looking at like 3 different kind of categories of what an image would look like, of like Earth is burning images, brighter futures possible images, and like then what we're talking a lot about here, the very motion oriented, like what are the solutions that are moving us from this to that. And so like in some conversations recently, we're exploring those 3 images and how they could work together. And so I guess my question is, are you looking at all about what sequences of images, like how different images in different categories could play together and how that captures people's attention and what that brings about in people?
That's a really good and interesting question, because yes, I've been just talking about, right, one image at a time, positive or negative, and the effect of those images. We haven't looked at a more complex picture of multiple images and how pairing multiple images or how different image sequences might add to that story or change the story potentially. I haven't really even thought about it before. So, but that's very interesting, and then something that we could potentially do, go back and mine our data to see if there's that led to different results, greater capture of attention by that last image or something. Although to really, I think, get at what you're asking, we probably need to design a task a little bit differently to make that sequence more obvious to the viewer, because over a couple of seconds, I guess the sequence might be lost. But so the boring answer to your question is no, we haven't done that, but definitely sounds really interesting. In terms of the first question, like you said, it kind of touched on that in a previous question. We haven't really assessed anybody's emotional state or level of well-being, although it is something that we would be interested in doing in the future. I guess I should just also add that this kind of area of research is pretty new to me in the lab. We haven't been down this road for very long, so we are still looking for and planning new research endeavors. So thanks for all those ideas there.
Yeah, it also made me think a bit about, I was asking you earlier about this idea of stories having this like casting alternation of kind of extremes and this kind of like ratio, like with the question about narratives that there could be. I mean, you could test it, couldn't you? You could test multiple narratives of these different images in a lab and to see how they worked and perhaps discover some optimal way to do it.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting too. And especially if we can guide people or train people to adopt the narrative and the outcome that we want them to. So if you take these steps, good things will happen. And so I've been talking about attentional bias today, and it's initially related to anxiety. I haven't talked about that part, but another cognitive bias that's related to anxiety is interpretation bias. And so I think these open-ended narratives kind of get on that type of bias, where we may have some people that are to just interpret the negative outcome of these open-ended scenarios, and other people that may have a more positive bias that's linked to actions and behaviors and things like that. And if we can train this bias as well as an attentional bias, then we'll be able to change those behaviors. And whether that's with some kind of marketing or design aspect, I'll leave that up to those of you that are kind of in that realm. But I think it's possible.
Next, we've got a question from Neil. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and thanks, Josh. Very enlightening discussion. Much appreciated. My question actually relates very briefly to what you just mentioned about marketing, because many of us find ourselves in the implied role of climate communication. So this is where these images and videos become really important. My question, though, it relates to more illustrations, so specifically graphs and things like that. Did they make up part of your study, and what was the reaction to those?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the images that we used in our study were actually from a earlier study that we did where we compiled a database of 300 and some images that were rated by a fairly large number of participants on their relevance to climate change, their emotional valence, and their emotional arousal. For that study, we excluded graphics and things like that. We didn't include those types of images, and I can't speak to the effectiveness of those images other than if those types of things, those graphics or those infographics included some of the same types of imagery that we used, that it would probably be applicable. But we purposely didn't really use anything that had words or those types of things, just because it takes a little bit longer to process, and we're looking at a very fast time. So just to give you an idea, we're looking at responses occurring in like 300 milliseconds. So just a fraction of a second, where you typically need a little bit more time to read through materials that might be on an infographic or something.
Much appreciated. About the attention span of a 13-year-old.
Yeah, maybe.
But that's actually raised a really interesting issue that we haven't even talked about today yet, which I think is something that's not particularly really ever talked about or understood in sustainability, is these immediate unconscious responses. And this came up a lot in one of our last sessions, where this is a Jap Harm's work, where he uses color and actually uses flashes, smiley faces and frowny faces at people so quickly they don't even know that they've seen it. And it still actually affects people's energy consumption. And this whole idea of when light is around in the ambient environment, it affects you, which opens up this entire discussion of how much of these very immediate and unconscious responses we get before we add in any kind of cognitive load. So if you have to have a chart, or you have to watch a documentary, or you have to look at your electricity bill and these very cognitively heavy things, you're in a really different state of mental engagement to when you're kind of like unconsciously, ambiently absorbing things, which is why color is so powerful as a way to communicate environmental data. And that really clarified me for our conversation with him, but also in your work, I can see how an image, if you see an image of something scary like a smokestack, I don't have any cognitive work to do to get emotionally impressed by that. I just see it, nothing occurs. Whereas if I'm having to look at a chart, I need to stop. I kind of have to close off my first reaction, because, well, there isn't any, and then I've got to like think about it. And it's a completely different process that's going on, that information versus that immediate kind of like emotional punch, right?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. It may be, and this is often the case, at least in some of the articles I've seen, where the information that's presented in words or charts or whatever is also accompanied by an image that might capture their attention, or the way that the chart is laid out in itself can be very attention grabbing. And so I'm thinking of the increase in temperature across years, and you look at the last decade or so and it's all red, that can easily grab your attention as well. The reason that we kind of use these more automatic, shorter display times, which result in faster reaction times, is people won't just look at that image and only look at that image, right? So they'll shift their attention from image to image over time, and they may look at one image longer than the other, but they won't only look at one image, at least as a rule. And so if we don't have eye tracking capabilities to kind of hone in on the overall fixation time, if you want to get at that initial capture of attention, then the stimuli need to be presented relatively brief. And I think ours were presented for about half a second. So sounds like a short period of time, but it's enough time to get all the information that you need. And then the response doesn't take a lot of cognitive effort either. They just have to locate the dot. And so once the stimulus or the images, the affective images disappear and the target is presented, it doesn't take long for them to respond to it. But yeah, so if you want them to engage in reading a paragraph or something, that's going to be a whole nother ballgame, I guess.
Yeah, it just made me think that perhaps when we're designing these campaigns and landing pages and all the stuff that we work on, we should make a clear differentiation between what is the immediate unconscious effect, like the impression that just gets them before any cognitive effort is exerted at all. And then once they have consciously decided to engage in cognitive effort, that's like another thing. Because a lot of projects people do, they completely overlook the immediate kind of unconscious salience. And they're just like, here's the 100-page PDF report with lots of complex language and charts. And they're like, why is nobody reading it? Like, seriously, these are the conversations I have in my real life. They're like, we made this amazing report that was 100 pages long, and we're just a bit worried that not enough people are reading it. Katie, can you like gamify it? Like, this is literally my job. Like, and I'm like, okay, let's unpack the PDF report and let's figure out what to do with it. But if you kind of like think of it as in two boxes, like what's the like immediate unconscious kind of like sponge, and then once they're there deciding to take action, they're kind of like through a gate. The person has consciously decided to go through the gate. I mean, that's kind of a different approach to how we go about this work.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any more questions? There's another one so Catherine Yuled, your hand is still up. Does that mean you want to ask a second question? No, Catherine says no. Yuled, did you have a second?
No, I just forgot.
Okay, no worries. Does anybody else want to put their hand up? We've got 10 minutes left. Okay. Because I can't differentiate with the chat on there. There's like so many chats. I can't figure out which one's a question and which one's not. Okay, cool. Well, I've just got a couple of questions and then to finish off. So Josh, I'm super curious about this concept of the creative and the innovation mind. So wait a sec. I can't see Josh anymore. Wait a sec. I'm going to ask again. Okay. So I'm really curious about this concept of this longer term, more complex creative and innovation mind. Most of the conversations and also the research around environmental change tends to fit into two boxes, which is how to write policy, how to get political policy through, how to engage people in the political process, and also individual actions, like how do we get people to eat less meat and use less electricity. But there's this other big pillar that I don't really see talked about much, which is how we engage in long-term innovation in terms of decades of my life contributed to very complex problem solving as a whole path. And I did a TED talk about a year ago in trying to scratch the surface on this, which is that if we're just using these scary images that are causing a freeze effect or turning people off, or maybe they're engaging people, but they're perhaps engaging people in a fear-stricken, alarmed way, that then, and I don't know that much about neuroscience, so my understanding of it is that, so perhaps they do grab attention to us. We're alarmed by it. We're engaged in this Greta Thunberg fear style. Then the amygdala is alerted. We're moving into a fight or flight response. We're potentially aggressive to other people and kind of startled. And then that is probably one of the worst headspaces to be in to do long-term complex innovation work of figuring out, how do I install hundreds of green roofs? How do I design software to figure out how to help megawatts of solar panels get put in? There's enormous long-term complex problem solving that is needed. And my hunch is that looking at these pictures of climate doom is probably the worst nutrient for that type of deep innovation work. But like I said, I don't really know that much about neuroscience, so I don't really know what I'm talking about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that if I'm on the right track, and how the brain works. And can you just explain that from an expert's point of view, what I'm fumbling to explain?
Yeah, and so I had watched your TED Talk too, and it actually, our data very nicely kind of map into that framework where we did, as you talked about in the talk, the positive images are capturing attention, they're facilitating the task. The negative images tended to result in slower reaction times and detracted from performance on the task, right? So that they were disengaged, at least temporarily, from completing the task, which resulted in those slower reaction times, which I think can be interpreted in the way that you're talking about, where the negative images kind of put you in a mind space where you're not very creative and you're not going to be able to complete the task. In terms of the neuroscience behind that, I think both of these, you could I mean, we don't know first. We haven't looked at the degree to which these types of images, at least as far as I know, this hasn't been looked at, are engaging different brain circuitry. That is something that we would like to look at. But in general, emotionally salient stimuli activate the amygdala, deep structure buried in the temporal lobe, traditionally known for its fight, flight types of responses, but also is involved in positive emotion. And I think if we go back to that dimensional model, is probably involved more generally in things that are very emotionally salient or arousing, things that are associated with elevated heart rates. And we think that the amygdala is involved in the attentional response to emotional stimuli as well, including positively valenced emotional stimuli and likely positively valenced emotional stimuli as well. But this attentional response also likely includes areas of the prefrontal cortex, including lateral prefrontal cortex or the anterior cingulate cortex, that help to choose between competing goals that an individual might have. So whether that's the goal of staying alive based on this threat that you're processing, or receiving a reward that you might have a cue for, as well as ongoing goals that you might have, like doing your job at work, or if you're a psychology participant, completing the task, finding the dot, those types of things. And so the prefrontal cortex helps to not only amplify the salience of the emotional information coming in, but to also regulate that to a point where we can complete the ongoing goal of detecting the dot, perhaps in this task or this particular scenario. So it seems that the negative images are engaging the amygdala in that fight flight way, and that the amygdala is probably activating brain stem structures associated with the freezing response, but maybe not to the same degree that we would see in other situations, prefrontal cortex structures that would help guide attention. Whereas perhaps we are seeing that with the positive stimuli. But again, we haven't run that study, so we don't know about that in particular. But if we can kind of extrapolate on some of the more general information that we know about emotional processing in the brain, we can perhaps speculate that that might be what's happening at a neural level. I'm not sure if I got off track on your question, or if that's the direction that you wanted me to go. But if not,
no, I think you answered it. But a lot of us, we don't really understand all the terminology, so it's a little bit hard for us to keep up. But I think I kind of get it. But it seems that if you need to do, this is the thing. This is the kind of like the bugbear I have, that I think it takes just really deep, complex, nuanced concentration that's a little bit hard to test in an academic study because it's over a lifetime. I mean, you can give somebody like a really complex mathematical bit of problem solving, kind of like what you would get on an IQ test, and then like freak them out beforehand and then see how well they do on the IQ test, right? But we're also talking about the kind of like emotional staying power. So you kind of like long-term grit involved in this, as well as the complex problem solving. So if you're going to perhaps develop a piece of software or a campaign, and it's going to take you 10 years to do that, think of like Elon Musk with Tesla. Like he's been at it for 20 years. It's this long-term project. And there's just a lot of relationships and a lot of complexity to navigate that's what we really need to ask of people. And so if you're trying to do that and your amygdala is activated, those brainstem circuits are fed up in the freeze effect, it sounds like that's just like that's like not helpful. Like it's not really gonna be the best way. So you're going to be constantly functioning subpar if you're in that amygdala, or I don't know how you explained it, brain circuit situation.
Yeah, I mean, don't want to give the amygdala too much of a bad rap, because it's definitely a necessary component of the brain. And in the short term, right, depending on the circumstance, in some circumstances, right, it facilitates behavior. It can lead to adaptive behaviors in that moment. But getting back to your question or your point, for a long extended period of time, you don't want to be in that fight, flight, and so that's right. I think what happens in a lot of high stress situations. You're in an extended period of fight flight, and it's not good for your health, and including your mental health and creative thinking as well. So while momentary bursts of amygdala activity to guide attention or to boost arousal might be helpful, like you're saying, that long-term sustained doom is probably not a good thing.
Right, and so I'll just ask you just two more questions just to wrap up and have a nice ending to our recording. So, if you were invited to a meeting where there were heads of government and heads of not-for-profits and people who are sustainability managers of cities, and they would say, "Please help us. We're trying to solve climate change." If you could just give one bit of advice to guide them in their journey, what would that be?
I guess given my limited data here, I would say stay positive and focus on what you can do to fix the problem.
Right. And what are you most excited about for your future research in this space?
So I kind of hinted a little bit earlier that we are doing some studies where we are training participants' attention, so trying to get them to attend more to the Valence climate change solutions. And our initial study has been successful in that regard. We have been able to get people to attend more to these images than they did before. So that's promising. And so the next step, which we haven't really engaged in yet, is seeing, so what? So how does that influence behaviors outside of the lab, or how can we get that to influence behaviors outside of the lab? And then, as brought up in the discussions here, how does that influence mood, and how might mood also influence these pro-environmental behaviors? And also kind of relevant to the discussions that we've had here, where we've kind of had to extrapolate on what's happening at a neural level. Can we directly assess that in the laboratory? And so what brain systems are guiding this attentional capture in this particular circumstance by these types of climate change relevant images? Or more broadly, do different attitudes or dispositions toward climate change or pro-environmental behavior map onto different brain circuits, or differences in those brain circuits? Not necessarily a different circuit, but you may see more gray matter or greater connectivity between regions or something like that. So these are areas that we haven't looked at, that we would be interested in kind of going down that road to see what's happening there.
So a bit more neuroscience and a bit more kind of behavior action design added in.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Josh. There's a lot of interest in this issue, in the movement, a lot of interest in solutions versus doom messages and how we use it and what it means. I think we really appreciate your time. There was a bit over, I think there was like 45 or almost 50 people when we started off. So that's been our most popular session to date. And we will we'll get produced into a podcast and a blog article and all of that in time. Really appreciate you being here.